The anti-slavery movement would prove to be the biggest reform movement of the 19th century, since slavery was the biggest issue dividing the nation. Some states had abolished slavery in the aftermath of the Declaration of Independence or in the early national period. Congress had weighed in on the issue when it banned slavery in the Northwest Territories, and then eventually banned the slave trade in 1808. After the War of 1812, the American Colonization Society was established with the goal of freeing slaves, but, due to racism and fear of competition for jobs in the North, wanted those free slaves to be transported out of the United States to colonies in Africa, particularly to Monrovia in Liberia. In all, they were successful in freeing some 12,000 slaves, who were then transported back to Africa. But their efforts really weren't practical because of the costs and the continued needs of the community of people that were being transported to Liberia. Because let's face it, you can't just drop people off and then leave. You had to help build a society. And then, of course, by the time of 1860, you had over 4 million slaves in the United States. The hope had originally been to gradually do away with slavery, which had almost seemed to be happening after the Revolution. But the invention of the cotton gin had renewed interest in slave labor. Therefore, you began to see a split in the anti-slavery movement, with the goal to end slavery immediately being the one that would come to the forefront. William Lloyd Garrison would be one of those adopting this more radical position. He was a newspaper publisher and anti-slavery advocate who wanted slavery to end immediately and by any means necessary. He frequently published first-hand accounts of the abuse faced by slaves on a regular basis, which horrified many of his readers. The point of view supported by his paper, The Liberator, led to the establishment of a radical group known as the American Anti-Slavery Society. Women frequently became involved in this abolitionist movement because slavery was seen as a moral issue, something that women had long been associated with. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were sisters from South Carolina who eventually came to the conclusion that slavery was wrong and needed to be abolished. They broke numerous state laws with regards to their treatment of their slaves, teaching them to read, for example, before they eventually left South Carolina and settled in the North. Lucretia Mott was an active member of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, raising money and spreading information to support the cause. But because she was denied the opportunity to speak at a larger international anti-slavery convention, simply because she was a woman, she would also become active in the women's rights movement. Black abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass would have perhaps the greatest impact on the anti-slavery movement because many could speak from personal experience about the evils and harshness of slavery. Douglass himself had been born a slave in Maryland and escaped slavery in about 1838. He described being taken away from his mother and grandmother at a very young age in his autobiography that was published in 1845. His writings were influential in promoting the cause of abolitionism, and he was a firm believer in the equality of all peoples, whether black, female, Native American, or even recent immigrant. Remember, this is at a time when nativism was on the rise, as we discussed in the last unit. Douglass was also a believer in dialogue and in making alliances across racial and ideological divides, and in the liberal values of the U.S. Constitution. In addition to ending slavery, he wanted to see African Americans to gain equal rights, including an end to racism in the North. Since escaping from slavery was nearly impossible, those sympathetic to the cause would often assist slaves in their efforts to reach freedom. The Underground Railroad, which was begun in the early part of the 19th century, was an organized system of routes and safe houses that assisted slaves attempting to run away. Initially, the efforts of the Underground Railroad, which is neither underground nor a railroad, it just borrowed railroad terminology to describe the locations and the roles of the participants, It would help slaves reach the relative safety of the northern states, where slavery had been outlawed. But after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, even the northern states were not safe, as slave catchers could seize anyone believed to be an escaped slave in order to return them to slavery in the South. And Northerners were required to assist in their efforts. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, the only true place of refuge was Canada, and so the Underground Railroad stretched all the way to the border. The South, reacting to increasing pressure from Northerners critical of the institution of slavery, as well as the growing abolitionism, and fearful that radical abolitionism would spread from smaller fringe groups to more widespread acceptance, the South began to put forth a significant defense of slavery. Some had previously portrayed it as a necessary evil at the time of the Revolution. Now they tried to show how Southern paternalism led to overall better treatment of slaves than Northern industrial workers were experiencing, whom the South called wage slaves. They tried to point out how these wage slaves of the North had lives that were often worse, and there were no provisions for them if they became too old or sick to work. Southerners tried to point out that their system was really a positive good for slaves, since they were cared for by their owners through all stages of life, and that owners had a vested economic interest in their slaves, since they were so valuable and could not easily be replaced. But of course, they were still slaves, and that was unacceptable to many Northerners, no matter what. The issue would ultimately be what plunges the United States into the coming Civil War.